There are nightmares you wake up from, and there are nightmares that are waiting for you when you open your eyes. In the summer of 2016, for a woman named Angela Diaz, the nightmare was real. It was relentless, and it had a specific instruction attached to it. The instruction was posted on the internet, buried in the solicitations of Craigslist. It was an advertisement featuring Angela's photo, her home address, and a terrifying invitation. The post claimed to be from Angela herself, and it asked for men to come to her home and act out a rape fantasy. The text was chilling in its specificity. It told strangers to walk through her front door. It told them that even if she screamed, even if she begged them to stop, they shouldn't. It said that her resistance was part of the game. It said, "I want you to force me." Imagine the psychological terror of knowing that invitation is out there. Imagine sitting in your living room, listening to the sound of a car engine outside, wondering if this is the moment a stranger kicks down your door, believing he has your permission to assault you. Angela Diaz didn't have to imagine it. She was living it. Men were showing up. Men were knocking on her door, ready to engage in a violent fantasy that she knew nothing about. But the internet ads were just the tip of the iceberg. Angela's inbox was flooded with emails that were so vile, so hateful, they seemed to vibrate with rage. One email read, "I will kill your baby." Another said, "You will die today." The harasser sent photos of aborted fetuses. They sent details about Angela's daily schedule, proving they were watching her every move. This wasn't just trolling, this was a hunt, and the police were fairly certain they knew exactly who the hunter was. In their eyes, this wasn't a mystery. It was a classic, albeit extreme, case of a woman scorned. The prime suspect was a woman named Michelle Hadley. She was the ex-girlfriend of Angela's husband, and according to the investigators, Michelle Hadley had transformed from a heartbroken ex into a digital terrorist who wouldn't stop until Angela Diaz was destroyed. To understand the ferocity of this hate, you have to understand what was lost. Before the threats and the police reports, there was a romance. In 2013, Michelle Hadley, a business school student, began dating Ian Diaz. On paper, Ian was a catch. He was a deputy US Marshal, a man trained in law enforcement, a protector. For 2 years, they lived a life that looked perfect from the outside. They shared a home in Anaheim, California. They had plans. They had a future. But in 2015, that future evaporated. The relationship crumbled. Ian Diaz ended things. And by all accounts, he ended things with the kind of finality that leaves a scar. He wanted Michelle out of his life. And he didn't waste any time mourning the relationship. Almost immediately after the breakup, Ian met Angela. It was a whirlwind romance, the kind that moves at a breakneck speed. They fell in love, they got married, and very quickly they announced they were expecting a baby. For Ian, it was a fresh start, a new wife, a new life, a child on the way. He had successfully turned the page. But Michelle Hadley, it seemed, was still reading the old chapter. According to the narrative that began to form, Michelle watched this new happiness from the sidelines, and something inside her snapped. It wasn't just that Ian had moved on, it was that he had replaced her so completely and so quickly. Angela was living the life Michelle thought was hers. Angela was carrying the child Michelle might have had, and that jealousy, the prosecution would later argue, curdled into a dangerous obsession. It started slowly. Angela began noticing odd things, unwanted magazine subscriptions showing up at the house, strange emails. But then, the dial was turned up. The emails weren't just annoying anymore, they were threatening, they were graphic. They detailed the specific ways the sender wanted Angela to suffer, and they were relentless. It was a bombardment of psychological warfare designed to make a pregnant woman feel unsafe in her own skin. Angela went to the police, terrified. She told them she was being stalked. She told them about the ex-girlfriend. And the evidence seemed to back her up. The emails appeared to be coming from Michelle. The IP addresses, the digital footprints, they all pointed in one direction. Then came the physical stalking. Angela reported seeing Michelle's car driving slowly past their condo. She reported seeing Michelle in the parking lot. The sanctuary of their home, the home of a US Marshal, had been breached. Ian, a man trained to handle federal fugitives, found himself unable to protect his own pregnant wife from an enemy who struck from the shadows of the internet. And then, the threats turned into action. The Craigslist ads went live. This is where the case went from a harassment dispute to a life-or-death situation. By posting those rape fantasy solicitations, the stalker was essentially putting a hit out on Angela, using unwitting strangers as the weapon. It was diabolical. It was a way to commit a horrific crime without ever getting your own hands dirty. One day, a man actually intercepted Angela as she was coming home. He grabbed her. It was the nightmare scenario coming to life. Angela managed to escape, screaming, calling 911 in a panic that is hard to listen to. She was hyperventilating, crying out that she was being attacked, that she was doing this to her. The she was Michelle. By the time the police put the handcuffs on Michelle Hadley, she looked like a monster. To the public, to the press, and to the police, she was the embodiment of the fatal attraction trope. Here was a woman so consumed by envy that she was willing to orchestrate the rape of a pregnant woman just to punish her ex-boyfriend. The brutality of the emails, referencing the unborn child, painted a portrait of someone who had lost all touch with humanity. Michelle claimed she was innocent. She cried in the interrogation room. She swore she hadn't sent those emails, that she hadn't posted those ads. But the police had heard it all before. Criminals always lie. Stalkers always deny. And looking at the terror in Angela Diaz's eyes, seeing a pregnant woman fearing for her life, it was impossible to believe the woman sitting across the table was anything other than guilty. Michelle Hadley was facing a life sentence, and at that moment it felt like justice was finally coming for her. On a quiet morning in Anaheim, the hammer finally dropped. When the police arrived at the home of Michelle Hadley's parents, they didn't come to talk. They came to take down a predator. Michelle, a 29-year-old MBA student, was dragged out of her normal suburban life and thrust into the back of a squad car. The scene was chaotic. Michelle was hysterical, weeping, confused. She kept asking what was happening, why she was being taken. To the officers on the scene, her performance was Oscar-worthy. They had seen the emails. They had seen the terror inflicted on Angela Diaz. They weren't interested in Michelle's tears. They were interested in stopping a woman they believed was on the verge of escalating from harassment to murder. Inside the interrogation room, the dynamic was cold. Michelle sat there, insisting over and over again that she had no idea what they were talking about. She claimed she hadn't emailed Ian or Angela in months. She claimed she had never been on Craigslist posting ads. She was begging them to believe her. But the detectives had a mountain of evidence sitting between them. This wasn't a case based on hearsay. They had the digital smoking gun. They had the IP addresses, the unique digital fingerprints that identify where an email comes from. And according to their tech team, those threats were coming from Michelle. Even worse, they had the men. The police had interviewed the strangers who showed up at Angela's door for the rape fantasy. These men didn't just appear out of thin air. They told the police they had been chatting with a woman who called herself Michelle. They had text messages, email chains, specific instructions provided by the woman coordinating the attack. Every single digital arrow pointed straight at the woman sitting in that interrogation chair. The justice system moved swiftly to crush her. The judge looked at the charges, stalking, criminal threats, attempted rape, and decided Michelle Hadley was a danger to the public. Her bail was set at $1 million. Let that number sink in. $1 million. That is the kind of bail reserved for murderers, for flight risks, for high-level kingpins. It was a statement. It said that Michelle Hadley was a monster who needed to be kept in a cage. So Michelle was locked up. She spent 88 days behind bars. For nearly 3 months, she sat in a cell, stripped of her dignity, her career, and her freedom. She was facing life in prison. The media had her mugshot plastered everywhere. She was the obsessed ex-girlfriend, the villain of the year. But as the days turned into weeks, and Michelle sat in that cell, a strange silence began to settle over the case. And in that silence, a few people started to ask a very uncomfortable question. The evidence against Michelle was overwhelming. In fact, it was almost too overwhelming. It was perfect. The digital trail was clear, the emails were explicit, the connection was direct. But Michelle was just a business student. She wasn't a hacker. She wasn't a computer engineer. How did a grad student with no criminal history manage to orchestrate a cyber-stalking campaign this complex? How did she know how to mask her location just enough to be hard to find, but leave just enough breadcrumbs to be caught? It felt tactical. It felt like an operation, and that's when eyes started to shift away from the crying woman in the cell and toward the other person in this love triangle. The man who wasn't just a victim, but a trained professional. The man who knew how investigations worked, how evidence was gathered, and how to track a target. The man who was a United States Marshal. Let's pause and look at the other person in the room. The man standing next to the weeping, terrified, pregnant victim. Ian Diaz wasn't a banker, or a teacher, or a mechanic. Ian Diaz was a Deputy United States Marshal. To the average person, that title just sounds like police officer, but it is much more specific than that. U.S. Marshals are the federal government's hunters. They are trained in high-level surveillance. They are experts in tracking fugitives. They understand how digital footprints are made, and more importantly, they understand how investigations are built. They know exactly what evidence a district attorney needs to secure a conviction. They know what makes a judge sign a warrant. As Michelle sat in jail, investigators and legal observers began to look at Ian's resume and wonder if the police had been played by one of their own. Think about the precision of the evidence found against Michelle. It wasn't messy. It was surgical. The IP addresses were traceable. The emails were sent at times that maximized the terror. The rape fantasy ads were posted with a level of callous efficiency that felt less like an emotional breakdown and more like a tactical operation. Michelle Hadley was a student. She had no background in cybersecurity or law enforcement. Ian Diaz, however, did. The theory that began to take shape was dark, but it made a terrifying amount of sense. What if Michelle wasn't the stalker? What if she was the target? Consider the breakup. It had been abrupt. Ian had moved on instantly. Perhaps Michelle was problematic. Maybe she was sending annoying texts or trying to get closure. And Ian, a man used to total control, wanted her gone. Not just gone from his house, but gone from society. What better way to permanently silence an ex-girlfriend than to frame her for a crime so heinous that no one would ever believe her innocence? If you look at the emails sent to Angela, the ones filled with threats and rage, linguistic experts could argue there were slips. Phrases that sounded authoritative. Tone that sounded less like a jealous woman and more like a man trying to sound like a jealous woman. Furthermore, who had access to Michelle's digital life? They had lived together for 2 years. Ian likely knew her passwords, her security questions, her habits. He knew her mother's address. He knew her schedule. If anyone had the capability to log into her accounts, spoof her IP address, and send threats to his own wife to stage a crime, it was Ian. And look at his behavior during the investigation. Ian was driving the case. He was the one handing evidence to the Anaheim PD. He was the one insisting Michelle was dangerous. He was the helpful federal agent, guiding the local detectives, pointing them exactly where they needed to look. It's a classic magician's trick. Force the audience to look where you want them to look, so they don't see what you're doing with your other hand. The narrative of the hero husband protecting his pregnant wife was perfect cover. Who suspects the grieving, terrified husband? No one. And that is exactly why he would be the perfect suspect. The deeper you looked at Ian Diaz, the more it seemed like he had constructed a psychological trap, using his own wife as bait to lock his ex-girlfriend away for life. It looked like the ultimate frame job, executed by a professional. Just as suspicion began to quietly simmer around Ian, the violence escalated to its breaking point. The threats stopped being digital and became physical, bloody, and horrifyingly real. On a nondescript afternoon, a 911 call came in from the Diaz residence that chilled the dispatchers to the bone. It was Angela. She was screaming. When police arrived at the condo, they found a scene straight out of a slasher film. Angela was in the garage, hysterical. Her clothes were torn, there were red marks on her skin. And most disturbing of all, there were zip ties cinched tight around her neck. She was gasping, crying out that she had been attacked. She told the officers a man had jumped her, a man sent by Michelle. He had tried to strangle her. He had assaulted her. But the physical trauma wasn't the end of it. In the days following this brutal garage attack, Angela delivered the most devastating news of all. She told Ian and the police that the stress, the trauma, and the physical assault had caused her to miscarry. The baby was gone. Now the case wasn't just about stalking, it wasn't just about attempted rape. In the eyes of the law and the public, Michelle Hadley was now responsible for the death of an unborn child. The stakes had just become infinite. But this is where the perfect story began to crack. Because while Angela was being treated by paramedics, and while Ian was grieving the loss of his child, the detectives were doing the boring, routine work of checking alibis. They looked at the timestamp of the attack. They looked at the time Angela claimed the man was in her garage, and then they looked for Michelle. If Michelle had orchestrated this hit, she would need to be in contact with the attacker, or at least in the vicinity to coordinate. Or if she was the one stalking Angela, she might have been nearby. But Michelle Hadley wasn't in Anaheim. She wasn't near the condo. She wasn't meeting with a hitman. Surveillance footage from a shopping center miles away showed Michelle shopping. She was walking through a store. She was buying coffee. She looked bored. She looked calm. She looked completely and utterly unaware that at that exact moment she was supposedly murdering a baby in a garage across town. This was the problem. The timeline didn't fit. It was physically impossible for Michelle to be the attacker. And if she had hired someone, where was the communication? There were no calls, no texts, no money transfers. So, the detectives were left with a terrifying void. Angela Diaz was attacked. She did have zip ties around her neck. The bruises were real. The trauma was real. But if Michelle didn't do it, who did? The suspicion swung back to Ian with violent force. Was this him? Did he hire someone to attack his own wife to seal the deal against Michelle? Was he sick enough to sacrifice his own unborn child to frame an ex-girlfriend? Or was there a third player on the board? A hitman? A stalker they hadn't identified? The police were standing over a crime scene that made no sense. They had a victim, they had a dead baby, and they had a prime suspect with an ironclad alibi. They were missing a piece of the puzzle. And they had no idea that the missing piece was standing right in front of them. The case was a mess. Michelle was in jail, but the evidence was starting to contradict reality. The alibis were too strong. The timeline was broken. And that is when the Orange County District Attorney's Office decided to do something that rarely happens in cases like this. They stopped looking at the suspect, and they started looking at the data. They brought in specialized digital forensics experts. These weren't just street cops, these were people who understood the architecture of the internet. They took every single email, every threat, every Craigslist post, and they began to deconstruct them, layer by layer. They noticed that the stalker was sophisticated. The emails were being routed through something called the Tor network. For those who don't know, Tor is a browser that bounces your signal around the world, from a server in France to one in Brazil to one in Russia. So that by the time the email lands in an inbox, it is virtually untraceable. It is the tool of spies, hackers, and people who have things to hide. It creates a digital mask. For months, the stalker had worn this mask perfectly. Every time they sent a death threat to Angela, they were invisible. The police had assumed this was Michelle's doing, or maybe Ian's expertise at work. But human beings are flawed. We get tired. We get lazy. We make mistakes. And the experts found the mistake. Buried in the mountain of data, there was a single instance, just one, where the stalker slipped. Maybe they were in a rush. Maybe their finger slipped on the mouse. Maybe the software glitched. But for whatever reason, on one specific day, a threat was sent without the Tor browser turned on. The mask dropped for a split second. Without the VPN encryption, the email carried its true origin stamp. It carried the real IP address. It was the digital equivalent of the killer dropping his wallet at the crime scene. The investigators ran the trace. They expected it to lead to a coffee shop, or a library, or maybe, if the darker theories were true, to Ian's phone. It didn't. The IP address traced back to a condominium in Anaheim. Specifically, it traced to a router inside the Diaz residence. Even more specifically, it traced to a cell phone connected to that router. It was Angela's cell phone. The emails threatening to kill Angela. The digital revelation was a bombshell, but in a court of law, you need more than an IP address to explain away a physical attack. You need to break the timeline. And once the investigators knew where to look, the timeline shattered like glass. They went back to the days of the worst stalking incidents. They pulled the 911 logs where Angela was screaming for help. They pulled the police reports where she described Michelle's car, Michelle's face, Michelle's voice. Then they pulled the surveillance tapes from the real world. It was a study in contrasts that was almost cinematic. Imagine a split screen. On the left side, you have the police reports from Anaheim. Angela Diaz is telling officers that at 1:15 p.m., Michelle Hadley was banging on her door, trying to break in, screaming obscenities. Angela is terrified, shaking, describing the assault in vivid detail. On the right side, you have CCTV footage from a shopping mall in a completely different city, stamped at 1:15 p.m. There is Michelle Hadley. She isn't screaming. She isn't banging on a door. She is walking through a department store. She is holding a cup of coffee. She is trying on sunglasses. She is paying for items with a credit card, signing her name with a steady hand. The timestamps matched perfectly. The stories did not. This wasn't just an alibi. It was proof of a fabrication so deep it was dizzying. Michelle couldn't be in two places at once. If she was buying a latte in Brea, she wasn't assaulting Angela in Anaheim. And then the other dominoes began to fall. The threats mailed from post offices? Michelle was at work when they were mailed. The drive-bys? Michelle was at the gym. Every single time Angela claimed she was being hunted, Michelle was verifiably living a normal, mundane life miles away. The realization hit the investigators with the force of a freight train. Michelle Hadley hadn't done any of this. She was innocent. But the twist went deeper. The suspicion about Ian, the theory that the US Marshal husband was the mastermind framing his ex, that crumbled too. Ian was reacting to real threats, real screams, real terror from his wife. He had been duped just as badly as the police. He wasn't the puppeteer. He was a puppet. There was only one person left standing in the wreckage of the truth, the one person who was always there when the emails arrived. The one person who was always the victim of the attacks. The monster wasn't the ex-girlfriend, it wasn't the husband. The call was coming from inside the house. The victim was the villain. Angela Diaz had done it all to herself. When the investigators pulled Angela's medical records, bracing themselves for the tragic details of a miscarriage, they found something else entirely. They found a blank page. There was no miscarriage, because there was never a baby. Angela Diaz had faked the entire pregnancy. The ultrasounds she showed Ian? Forged. The doctor's appointments? Fake. The growing belly? Padding and performance art. The miscarriage that she blamed on Michelle, the tragedy that had Ian weeping for his lost child, was a biological fiction. She had played on the deepest, most primal protective instincts of her husband, mourning a life that never existed. And the physical evidence of the attacks? The brutality in the garage? It was all self-inflicted. Police found a credit card receipt in Angela's financial records. It wasn't for baby clothes, it was for a hardware store. Angela had gone out and purchased the exact zip ties that were found around her neck. Reconstruct that moment in your mind. Angela Diaz standing alone in her garage, ripping her own shirt, taking a heavy-duty zip tie, looping it around her own throat, and pulling it tight until it cut into her skin, until she couldn't breathe, until the bruises formed. She was willing to choke herself, to risk her own life, just to sell the narrative. She beat herself black and blue to frame an innocent woman. But the question screaming to be asked is, why? Why go to these lengths? Why destroy Michelle Hadley? The answer lies in a twisted, toxic obsession with Ian. Angela knew Ian had loved Michelle. She knew they had a life together. And she was terrified that he would go back. She didn't just want to be Ian's wife, she wanted to be his occupation. By inventing a stalker, Angela turned herself into the ultimate damsel in distress. By making Michelle the villain, she forced Ian into the role of the hero protector. As long as Angela was in danger, Ian couldn't leave her. As long as she was under attack, he had to focus 100% of his energy on her. She weaponized his own job as a US Marshal against him. We thought the trap was built by the boyfriend to frame the ex, but the reality was so much darker. The trap was built around the boyfriend. Angela created a prison of lies, locked Ian inside with her, and threw away the key. Michelle Hadley was just collateral damage, a prop in Angela's sick play to keep her husband from ever looking away. In January 2017, the nightmare finally ended. The cell door opened, and Michelle Hadley walked out into the California sun. Not as a felon, but as a free woman. But the courts went a step further than just dropping the charges. In a rare and powerful legal move, the judge declared Michelle factually innocent. In the legal world, this is the holy grail. It doesn't just mean there wasn't enough evidence to convict, it means the court is stating definitively that the crime never happened at her hands. It wipes the record clean. It acknowledges that the system failed her completely. While Michelle was reclaiming her life, the handcuffs were being placed on the real predator. Angela Diaz was arrested. The woman who had cried in courtrooms and screamed on 911 calls now stood silent as the charges were read against her: kidnapping, false imprisonment, grand theft, and perjury. Confronted with the overwhelming evidence of her own digital footprint and the credit card receipts for her torture devices, Angela pleaded guilty. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison. As for Ian Diaz, the US Marshal who thought he was protecting his family, he filed for divorce immediately. He had been sleeping next to a woman who was capable of framing an innocent person for rape. He had been mourning a child that never existed. He was the unintended victim of a con artist who used his own profession to manipulate him. Michelle Hadley spent 88 days in a jail cell. 88 days where she was looked at as a monster. 88 days where she feared she would die in prison for a rape fantasy she never wrote. She lost time, she lost money, and she lost her peace of mind. All because one woman decided that destroying a life was a fair price to pay to keep a husband. This case stands as a terrifying modern parable. It shows us how fragile the truth can be in the digital age, where an IP address can convict you and a spoofed email can ruin you. But more than that, it is a chilling reminder about the nature of manipulation. We are taught to believe the victim. We are taught to protect the crying woman. But Michelle Hadley's story teaches us that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the one holding the gun. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one crying victim.